UNLV Microcertificate Economics. Monopoly now. Monopoly is when there is one seller, when you have a choice of buy it from them or don't buy it. Electricity in Las Vegas. If you don't have your own solar panels on your house, you got to buy from NV Energy. And in fact, if you have your own solar panels on your house, NV Energy is still going to make you pay a fee. They're a monopoly. Remember perfect competition. We had many small sellers, we had free entry, and they were producing identical products. Monopoly is going to take away those assumptions, right? So monopoly, we have one seller. There isn't anything else that's like this thing. No close substitutes. And let me give you an example of how this plays out in the real world. The governments once sued the makers of saran wrap, claiming they were a monopoly, because at the time they were the only company that made clear plastic wrap. The jury said, "Are you kidding us? There's Tupperware, there's aluminum foil, you with me? There are other things that pretty much do anything that the clear plastic wrap does." The jury said, no, they're not a monopoly. To be a monopoly, you have to have no close substitutes. Nothing else that really can replace this thing. And then you have to have what we call barriers to entry. You have to have ways of stopping new competitors from starting up. So where do these monopolies come from? Well, most of them come from three things. We have what we call natural monopolies. A natural monopoly is one that's a monopoly because of costs. A natural monopoly simply means that there are businesses where the bigger you are, the lower your costs are. And aluminum smelting has always been that way, bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's very difficult for most countries to have more than one aluminum smelter because the bigger the smelting operation is, the lower the cost of the aluminum. There are people who think that electricity is kind of that way. The bigger the power company, the cheaper they can produce electricity. If I can produce everything cheaper than you can, I'm going to run you out of business. And it's just going to be a natural phenomenon of the marketplace. Number two, I might own something. And number three, there might be legal barriers. And we'll talk here for a second about those. So ownership, we mean scarce natural resources. We need cobalt. Every battery, as we switch to more and more reliance on electricity, right now all the batteries we use require cobalt in them. 80% of the world's cobalt mines that are operating right now are owned by China. They're in Africa. The cobalt mines are mostly in Africa, but they're controlled by China. There's actually cobalt in Nevada, but it's in places that, and I'm sure we're going to start mining it in Arizona too. We'll start mining it, but it's on land that's historic land for Native American indigenous populations, and so there's environmental and other issues there, but odds are we're just going to start digging that up because we don't want China to have a monopoly on cobalt. Diamonds are not technically monopoly. Diamonds are the most plentiful of all the gemstones, and yet they're expensive because there's one company, De Beers, South African company. They basically control all the diamond mines in Africa, and they have a partnership with Russia, and so they can control how many diamonds reach the market, and in doing so, they can affect the price of diamonds. And the same thing can happen if a country has one port or one river, or there's one well outside a town, or, right? There are various other ways that this can occur. Most monopolies, though, don't come that way. Most monopolies come because we have legal barriers. So NV Energy is the only power company. Cox is the only cable company. Right? Republic Services is the trash company. Those companies have what we call public franchises. Just like McDonald's franchises McDonald's. And to be a McDonald's, you have to own a McDonald's franchise. To be the power company in Las Vegas, you have to own a government franchise to do that. And for various reasons, we conclude that it's better just to have one electric company and one gas company and one trash company and one right? And so we create these monopolies through these public franchises. Number two, we have patents. So you invent a new medicine for a period of years, usually 17 years. You're the only one that can produce that. You create a new technique to produce, better steel. Then for a period of time, you control that kind of steel, and you're the only one that can make it. The advantage of the patent is that it encourages people to be creative and invent new things because they can be a monopoly, and monopolies, as we're going to see, can charge higher prices and make a lot of money. If you write or sing, you copyright things, right? Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling was a poor single mom struggling to get by. Now she's richer than the queen. That's because we own copyrights. If she had published her first book and there weren't copyrights, then everybody in the world could have written Harry Potter books, and they could have just photocopied their stories, and she's not going to make any money. And why is she going to do that? She's going to do something else, okay? Metallica has been very clear that they make music so they can make money. If copyrights don't exist, then that money stream is substantially less. Okay, so copyrights, but again, copyrights are supposed to expire, right? The Constitution says Congress can create copyrights for a limited time. The same with patents, for a limited time. Okay, patents at 17 years, that seems like a limited time. Copyrights, typically it's the author's life plus, 70 years, and it's going to be 21-something before Harry Potter comes off a copyright. That does not seem to me to be a limited time, but the Constitution's vague on that. All right? So most monopolies that are created in our world are creations of the government. All right, economists use this word rent, and we use this word rent to mean a payment in excess of opportunity cost. And you're saying, well, that's what I used to pay on my apartment, or what I do pay on my apartment. That's because in the really old days, before economists figured out marginal, economists didn't think that land really should have much value. Right? It can't move. It can't go away. It doesn't need to take a vacation. So they thought landlords were pretty useless, and therefore the payment that got made to landlords was a rent. It was just an excess payment. It didn't need to be made. We know that that's not true because we know that marginal, and we'll talk about that when we talk about land. So that word rent got attached to that. It means something you didn't earn. You get something you didn't earn, and you think your landlord might not actually earn the rent that you pay them, but rent in an economic sense is something you didn't earn. Monopolies engage in what we call rent-seeking behavior. They try to earn things that they're not really entitled to in a free market. All right? Some terms. Consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the difference between what you actually paid for something and the highest amount you would have paid. It's what you gain from trade. So you walk into Subway and you've got $7 and you order a sandwich, and you're willing to give them the whole $7. If they say to you, $7, you go, okay, here's my $7. But you get to the end of the line and they go, $5. Well, whoa. I was willing to pay $7. The value of the sandwich to me is $7. I only had to pay $5. So I walked in with $7. I'm walking out with a sandwich that I valued at $7, plus I still have $2 left in my pocket. In a sense, I walked in with $7, I walk out with $9. I gained from the exchange, right? All consumers gain from the exchange. We're willing to pay more for something than we actually had to pay. So consumers are gaining. We're gaining this consumer surplus. How much I would have paid if I had been willing to pay, $500 for my plane ticket to Hawaii and I only had to pay $400, I gained $100 of consumer surplus. Okay? Now the opposite of this is producer surplus. The business is going to sell you something, and generally speaking, they would have sold it to you for less if they had to, but they don't have to. It's the difference between what you paid for something and the lowest amount the business would have accepted. It's the business's gain from trade. Remember, Adam Smith says both sides gain from trade. We wouldn't make the trades if we didn't gain from them. So the consumer gains consumer surplus, and the business's gain is called producer surplus. Together, that's total surplus. But let's just ignore that now. Consumers are made better off by the transaction. Businesses are made better off by the transaction. All right? So what do monopolies do? Well, the most basic, the most simple monopoly behavior. You can only buy this thing from me. Right? So let's suppose that only one airline is allowed to fly to Hawaii now. So if you want to go to Hawaii, you got to go on Hawaiian. Well, Hawaiian, what they want to do then is make sure that there are fewer seats going to Hawaii than there are people who want to fly. Now we get into a bidding war for those seats, and the price of the seats is going to go up. That's why college teams play in giant, sometimes in 100,000 seat, 110,000 seat stadiums, but the pro stadiums are smaller because the pro teams want there to be more people who want to go to their games than there are seats in the arenas. So monopolies restrict output, and that allows them to raise their price. Okay? Oil companies are great at this. Even though they're not monopolies, they work through OPEC. They conspire with each other, essentially. Saudi Arabia could produce far more oil than they do. They used to. But they shrink the amount of oil they produce. The United Arab Emirates shrinks the amount of oil they produce. By intentionally restricting output, they drive the price up. They create scarcity. Right? A monopoly is in a position where it's able to create scarcity. They increase their producer surplus when they do that because they raise the price, and they decrease consumer surplus. So the monopoly on its face is going to make the consumers worse off and itself better off. Okay? Everybody get that? Now, there's a problem with this that makes it even worse, and we call that problem dead weight loss. What happens if I'm selling tickets to go to Hawaii and I create this scarcity and I drive the price up? Some people who should have been able to afford the ticket can't. We have priced some of the consumers out of the market. They're not willing to pay the new higher price. Those people lose all of their consumer surplus. But that consumer surplus doesn't end up in the airline's pocket because those people aren't flying. So we've just disconnected these consumers from the market. We call this a deadweight loss. It's a loss to society because some consumers are priced out of the market. We're going to lose this surplus, and it's going to go away. The consumers that are flying to Hawaii, their consumer surplus has been transferred into producer surplus, right? We've converted all the people who are on all those planes, we've converted their consumer surplus to producer surplus. Some of it, not all of it, but some of their consumer surplus has been transferred. But the people who are priced out of the market now, their consumer surplus is just gone. And we call that a deadweight loss. What does that mean? It means monopoly lowers the total well-being of society. If the monopoly raises price so that consumers who are buying the product pay $10 more and the producer gets $10 more, that's bad, we might argue, but it's still, society still has the same amount of money. But these other consumers over here who would have paid, they're gone. Their money does not get moved over to the business. And so there's a net loss to society from rent seeking. The monopoly creates a net loss to society. Okay? The total loss of consumer surplus to the businesses is more, to the consumers, is more than the gain of producer surplus to the business. Society is a net worse off. All right, so what else do monopolies do? Well, the second major behavior that monopolies engage in is what's called price discrimination. Price discrimination is charging different prices to different buyers or groups of buyers. Okay? If you're a business, it's not just Monopoly that does this. Obviously, the other kinds of businesses can do it too that aren't monopolies, but Monopoly does it the best. All right? Price discrimination. There's three basic kinds. I put these players clubs up there. In this sense, there are 5 kinds of people who play at the casino, right? There are people who don't have a card, and then there are 4 different groups of players who do have a card. Each group gets different prices, different benefits, different, and that's price discrimination. All right? So there's first-degree price discrimination. First-degree price discrimination is when we charge different prices to each customer. This doesn't happen very often. It sometimes happens and you don't even realize it. A lot of the hotels, for example, they keep track of their customers, right? And so you may have a 2,000-room hotel and there's 300 different rates being charged for the rooms in the hotel because they have a computer system in the hotel which is doing revenue management, and it's got a bunch of statistical equations, and they try to figure out how to maximize the amount of money you're going to spend in the casino. So if you're not a gambler, you'll probably pay a higher room rate. If you're a heavier gambler, you'll pay a lower room rate. Car dealers do this, right? They negotiate. And turns out most consumers don't like that. We don't see that very often. Second-degree price discrimination is discrimination by quantity. So you fly 10 flights, you get an 11th one free. You buy 10 hamburgers, you get an 11th one free. Right? You buy one ream of paper, it's $6, but if you buy 10, they're $5.50 each. Different prices for different quantities. The third-degree price discrimination is different prices in different markets or market segments. If you live in San Diego, depending on how good or bad your insurance is, you're likely to go across the border into Mexico to fill your prescriptions because you can get exactly the same medicine from exactly the same factory, except the directions are in Spanish, and it's a lot cheaper in Mexico than it is, right? And if you go to Mexico and you don't have a prescription, they'll write you one and sell you the stuff anyhow, right? And then you walk back in the United States and the guard says, there's a guy there with a gun. He goes, do you have anything to declare? And you go, drugs. And they go, okay. So people do this on the Canadian border as well. They cross the border into Canada because drugs are less expensive in Canada. We have senior discounts, right? You're over a certain age, you get a cheaper price. You're under 12, you can go to the movies cheaper. You go to the movies in the matinee, you get a cheaper price than if you go at night. All those things are third-degree price discrimination. Happy hour at your favorite pub. That's third-degree price discrimination. So what happens here in monopoly? Monopolies are not productive efficient. Their price is not the lowest possible cost. They don't have an incentive necessarily to really cut costs because they have so much control over their price and their customers. They're not resource allocative efficient. Monopolies earn a rent. They're gaining money at others' expense. It's not resource allocative efficient. Eliminating monopoly is therefore what we call Pareto optimal. You remember Pareto. We can eliminate a monopoly and make everyone better off and no one worse off. Okay? So we can say conclusively monopoly is bad in an economic sense because eliminating it is Pareto optimal. Okay. So now we want to talk about most businesses which are in between somewhere perfect competition and monopoly.